Well, good evening, everyone. It's nice to see another sellout crowd for the auditorium during our D-Day commemoration. I'm Tim Reeves. I'm the Deputy Director, and we're going to get started here with Dennis Okerstrom in just a moment. I want to first remind myself to observe a moment of silence with my cell phone from now till about 8:30, just so that we don't interrupt our speaker or the recording of the program that's being done tonight. Again, today's program is part of our week-long commemoration of the 75th anniversary of D-Day, which would not happen without a lot of sponsors, and foremost, the support of the Eisenhower Foundation and all of these great sponsors that you can see on the screen. As most of you probably know, we're part of the National Archives and Records Administration, and public programs and museum exhibits are not paid for by the federal government. So if there was not an Eisenhower Foundation or other folks to help us, none of these great programs would happen. So we are ever grateful for their support. Tonight's special guest is Dr. Dennis Okerstrom. He's been here a number of times. He's now Professor Emeritus at Park University, which is just across the river from Kansas City, Missouri, and retired last spring after 35 years of teaching as the Mary Barlow Professor of Language and Literature. He's authored 6 books, including Project 9, Birth of the Air Commandos in World War II, which won the Best Air Power Book Award from the Air Force Historical Foundation in 2015. And of course, we have his books available in the gift shop, and he'll be happy to inscribe them after his talk tonight. Dennis was named Distinguished Faculty Scholar and Distinguished Humanities Faculty, and in 2018, he was honored with the university's first ever Presidential Meritorious Service Medal. And if that isn't enough, he's also a pilot and a flight instructor with pilot and command time in more than 36 aircraft, including multi-engine seaplanes, and most relevant perhaps tonight, gliders. And he's also a veteran of the U.S. Coast Guard. And I was told also, before I forget, to let you all know that at 8:30 there will be a VFW vigil, which will start here and proceed to the place of meditation. And now I would like to introduce Dr. Okerstrom.
Thank you, Tim. I really appreciate the kind words. You know, I learned a long time ago, if you want kind words said about you, you write them yourself, which is, yeah. So, first of all, thank you all for being here. You know, this is really gratifying for me to be one of the invited speakers for this very important and very special 75th anniversary commemoration. And we're real careful not to call it a celebration. It is a commemoration. And in no way are we celebrating, but we are marking it. And I think that's really important. So thank all of you for coming out tonight. You know, I know there are lots of other things you could have been doing, and maybe even kind of wish you had now that you've taken a look at me. But you know, we've had some really awful weather. I'm from Independence. My wife and I live in the old Truman Historic District of Independence, and we've had the wettest May on record. It has rained, I swear, every single day. And when I looked last week at what the weather was going to be here, they said, yeah, it's going to rain every single day this week in Abilene. So I'm ecstatic that it's not raining. Okay. But anyway, again, thank you all for being here. You know, if the weather had cooperated 75 years ago, we would be wrapping up the first day. Today would have been the commemoration of the invasion. It was originally set, most of you probably already know this, for June the 5th. But the weather was so bloody awful, both for flying and for trying to get boats ashore, that they postponed it. And then they made the decision finally that there was going to be a little break in the weather and they needed to do this thing. There was some disagreement among Ike's staff, but he made the decision and said, no, we're going to do it. And you can imagine why. You know, you had all those tens of thousands of troops at peak edge, ready to go, and you can't maintain that for very long. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit tonight about gliders. Yeah, those old-fashioned kind of no-go-around, kind of no-engine, quiet birds, okay? As Tim mentioned, among other things that I fly, I am a glider pilot. And, it's a lot like flying, except quieter. Right? The gliders on D-Day were apparently not very quiet. They were big square framed contrivances that you could drive a Jeep into, and you'll see photos of those here in just a little while. And that canvas side just flapped against that metal frame, and it sounded like somebody out there beating on a garbage can with a hammer. That's what everybody who's ever ridden in those has told me. So it does seem a little strange, at least to me, maybe not to you, but it seems a little strange to be talking about primitive flying machines like gliders in the age when, they were on the very cusp. They were already developing jet-powered aircraft. So why are we reverting back? Gliders, had been a long time dream of humans. Most of you probably have looked up and watched the birds, maybe when you were little, or even thought, oh, I wish I had wings. I wish I could do that. It's my belief that they probably have done that, since they first saw birds able to fly across rivers and fly up mountains, and it was just so much easier, And we know that some of the earliest myths, involved the use of flight. Some of you may have heard of Daedalus and Icarus. Anybody? Okay. Yeah. Okay. That's the one where Daedalus told Icarus, now, okay, we're going to fly off this island and escape this prison and get out of here with these wings that I've made out of feathers and wax. But whatever you do, son, don't fly too close to the sun. Keep it low. I haven't really researched this as much as I should, so maybe I shouldn't really hypothesize in this way, but I think Icarus was probably a teenager. Yeah. Have any of you had teenagers? Were any of you ever teenagers? Okay. Then you know what I'm talking about. Whatever you tell them, they're going to do the opposite. Yeah. Raised 4 of them. Love them like crazy, but teenage years, I'm actually only 29 years old. Okay. Well, we know that gliders had been a long time dream of humans, and the reason that I'm pretty sure that they were gliders that they were dreaming about way back in the day is because they didn't have any engines, to put in one. So of course they were thinking about gliders. How else would you fly, right? So in 1944, and that's the year that we're talking about, I want you to think for just a moment, how many of you, not that you were here, but how many of you remember your history books and remember the year that those bicycle brothers from Dayton first put an engine on a glider? Remember what year it was? 1903. Now we're going to go forward 41 years. That's what I'm talking about. Okay, that, the things that we're talking about tonight in the invasion of Normandy, they're going to revert at a time when they could have been flying jets or, almost anything, and they're going to use gliders? We'll talk a little bit more about that and try to figure it out. But anybody here old enough to remember the comic strip Terry and the Pirates? Yeah, okay. The hero, some of you may remember of that, it was a World War II comic strip that featured this sort of lantern-jawed fighter pilot, eagle-eyed and all of that, and his name was Flip Corken. He was a bird colonel in the Army Air Forces. The real Flip Corken was a guy named Philip Cochran, who happened to be a friend of Milton Caniff, the artist. And he was the commander of a group that became fairly well known, at least in the Burma theater. They were the first air commandos, they were called, okay? And they took gliders into Burma, into Japanese territory, about 200 miles behind the lines, carrying British commandos in gliders, landing in clearings in the jungle at night. Yeah. And Cochran was a fighter pilot, and he said, people that fly airplanes are fool enough, but anyone that gets into one of those gliders is a damn fool. Okay. He said it, I didn't. Okay. Well, we know that the whole Daedalus and Icarus thing ended badly for Icarus, and then about 500 years ago, Some of you may have heard of a guy named Leonardo da Vinci. Okay, and he's still interested in flight and gliders and so on. No engine, remember, they don't have them. Okay, and he did some pretty fine drawings. Almost all of these early contraptions featured flapping of the wings, just like a bird, because that's what birds do. Okay, so he did a really nice detailed drawing, but he never tried to fly one. Okay, but in the intervening, say 300 or 400 years since he drew that, a lot of people tried, and a lot of people died. They would make themselves what they thought was the perfect glider, and then climb to the tallest building in the village, or the closest really steep cliff, and jump off. Yeah. None of them lived very long to tell how thrilling that was on the way down. I did try hang gliding one time. It ended badly too. Okay. In the 1890s, in Germany, there was an engineer named Otto Lilienthal. There he is. Okay, he deduced that humans were never going to be able to flap hard enough and long enough to get airborne. So he said, let's not try that. He built a rigid wing and ran down the side of a hill and let the air currents get him aloft. And he did that for several years. It ended badly too. He was killed in a glider crash. Are you seeing a pattern here? Yeah. Okay. Well, and then we get, as I say, the Wright brothers, the bicycle brothers of Dayton, and they began experiments with flight at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, with gliders. This is the 1902 version of it. And then they found a way to mount that engine, and they introduced powered flight to the world in 1903. Well, as soon as the power came in, okay, people lost a lot of interest in gliders, particularly with its kind of a bad safety record. You know, almost everybody had gotten dead who tried it. Okay, getting dead is a lot worse than getting hurt. Okay, it's kind of like a real step up from getting hurt. You don't get second chances. Okay. And then we end up with the First World War, and that's when huge advances began. From 1914, you see the kite-like things that they were flying, to 1918, there's a huge amount of just experimentation and advancement in flying machines. We get, by that time, although it was a horrific meat grinder, it was quite a laboratory for furthering flying machines. Pilots began shooting each other with pistols, because that's what people do, I guess, if you're at war. And then machine guns, and finally they figured out a way to drop bombs from some of these aircraft. And by the war's end in 1918, they had bombers capable of flying hundreds of miles and dropping large explosive devices on cities. They had fighters that were capable of achieving speeds and altitudes that were never before even dreamed about and they were being flown by every combatant. Why then were gliders resurrected? You know, at the end of this time, we've got powered flight. Why even bother with gliders after this? Well, how could such a flimsy aircraft even possibly be put to any kind of a military use? I hope by the end of tonight you'll know the answer to that. I may even tell you. So the seeds of this rebirth of gliders, you know, can be found in the Treaty of Versailles. Okay, most of you probably are already aware of that, and you know all the details of it. You know the subparts. You know, remember Part 3, Subpart B. Okay, yeah. Well, the Treaty of Versailles, most of you remember, punished Germany really harshly for the war, and reparations were demanded, you know, by the victors, and additionally, besides all of the reparations, the money, and all of that, they disbanded the 6 million man German army and said you can have 100,000 men, you know, for defensive purposes, but your army's done, okay? And Air Force, I think the official sort of diplomatic language of the Versailles Treaty was, you ain't gonna have an Air Force, okay? They took it away completely. And that was for an Air Force that had produced such storied flyers as Baron Manfred von Richthofen. Okay, you remember him, the 80 ace, the 80 victory ace of the German Air Force. But the framers of the Versailles Treaty weren't nearly as smart as they thought they were. Okay. Besides, they had all these provisions which tended more or less to aggravate the Germans more than anything else, and it forced them to do some secret kinds of clandestine treaties with Russia, where they agreed to some training and buying new weapons, under some strange names. And some things were done openly because the treaty was so porous. And by that I mean civil aviation was fine. Okay, you can have your airliners and air taxis and things like that, but you're not going to build any military aircraft. So the Germans, being sort of cagey in this way, said, you know what? Every single airliner that we build is going to be built with a design that we can switch this into being a bomber or a cargo aircraft anytime we want, and that's what they did. And some of you may be familiar with the old tri-motor, the Yonkers 52, and that was a civil airliner before the war, and then it became a really, really ubiquitous kind of a troop carrier. And in the meantime, they also began encouraging, because the treaty didn't say a single word about gliders. And so the Germans began to develop gliders, en masse. And they began encouraging German youth to become glider pilots. Okay, and then it became official. They began sponsoring meets and so on. Okay, and by the time that hostilities renewed in 1939, there were some 300,000 German glider pilots ready to transition into fighters and bomber cockpits. Okay, they were ready. Okay. The U.S. and Britain, however, in the meantime, said, gliders? We don't need stinking gliders. We've got powered aircraft, okay? And so all the energy and attention that Germany was sort of showering upon the glider industry went into the manufacturing of small airplanes, and nobody thought very much about gliders. There was a small glider movement in the U.S. I won't say that there wasn't. Okay, but not anything like Germany had been forced to do. And then, the war came along in 1939. Most of you know that, September of 39. And they said, so Germany's been developing some gliders. That's nice. Gliders? Really? I don't think we can need gliders. I just don't think so. And then came the Battle of Fort Eben-Emael in May of 1940. Okay. Some of you may remember something about, the invasion of France and all of that. Okay, we're still back at French Newport fighters, and we kind of need to get up to Fort Eben-Emael. Yeah. This is sort of interconnected with the Maginot Line. Some of you have probably heard about that one. That was this construction, all of these, sort of impregnable forts along the French border to keep the Germans out of France. They had decided they didn't want anything else to do with Germany, and the best thing to do is to build these very, very impregnable, a whole line of defensive forts. Fort Eben-Emael was a Belgian fort that was kind of an extension of the Maginot Line. The builders of the Maginot Line and of Fort Eben-Emael, said, you know what, this place is impregnable. What are we going to do? They just put their minds to it, their good Teutonic brains, and said, we'll go around them. We're not going to do this frontal assault. That's really silly. Okay, people tried that in World War I and all. It was kind of like a war in World War I to see how many young men's chests it took to wear out a machine gun. Okay, and so we're not going to do that again. We're not going to do these frontal assaults if there's any way around it. And so the fort of Eben-Emael was huge. It was built by the Belgians in the mid-1930s. It was an extension of the Maginot Line, as I said. It was the largest of its kind at the time, some 2,000 feet by 2,400 in a rough triangle shape. It was built on the side of a small mountain, Mont St. Peter. It was considered impregnable, as other things were. It had thick casements, clochers, pillboxes, artillery cupolas that could be raised and lowered. Much of it was underground and capable of withstanding aerial bombings as well as frontal attacks. It was carved out of the granite of the mountain. And there were subterranean barracks, some 5 miles of interconnecting tunnels, an underground power plant. And it overlooked, okay, it's right in the corner of Belgium and the Netherlands, Germany, okay, and just south of Maastricht, if you know where that is, okay. It stood guard over the Albert Canal that had 3 bridges that spanned it, and those bridges were wired with explosives that could be detonated from the fort, Eben Emael, okay. That would prevent Hitler's panzers and troops from crossing over the river, okay, and they could get, Belgian and other reinforcements up and stop that. But in the middle of this triangular fort, on the top of it, there was this large sort of, well, they used it as a parade ground. Okay, it was just a large, flat, green area, and it sort of gave some grace to all this gray granite that was around them. It was flat, it was grass covered, it was bucolic. And on the night of May the 10th, it made a really great glider landing ground. You saw that one coming, didn't you? Yeah. Well, the powerless aircraft were part of a contingent of 42 combat gliders that they were DFS 230s for those of you who are into that, okay? Each held about 9 German troops. And they took off at 3 in the morning from Cologne, Germany, an airport outside of the city. They'd been kept inside these hangars so nobody could see them. And Junkers 52s showed up, about 3 in the morning. Okay, when nobody could see them. They wheeled these out, hooked them on, the troops boarded, and off they took. Okay. A dozen of them or so headed for Eben Emael. The others were headed for the 3 bridges, okay, that were close by, and they were going to obviously overpower the guards, disarm the explosives before they could trigger the bombs to destroy these spans. This kind of an assault had never been done before in all of recorded history of warfare. These silent gliders touched down beside the bridges. Some 300 German glider troops stormed the spans and cut all the wires so they couldn't be blown up. There was enough racket made by all of that because they were firing their guns and so on that somebody in the fort was able to push a button and blow up one of the spans, but they did manage to secure 2 still intact. And inside Fort Eben Emael, the gliders were equally successful. They had wrapped the skids of the gliders because skids, think of like runners on a sled, okay? They took off with wheeled landing gear, and as soon as they were airborne, they dropped them, okay? And then when they landed, they were just on sled-like skids. And they wrapped those with barbed wire to keep from skidding, to go over, so they would have a very short landing distance. And they also deployed drogue chutes that would also shorten the distance. So these planes landed atop Eben Emael. And the German troops rushed out of these flimsy aircraft. They were firing their submachine guns. They were using flamethrowers. And they spiked these big guns, and they trapped the Belgian garrison of some 650 men below ground. Okay? Soon reinforcements arrived, but that entire operation involved 85 German troops, and they took that fort using gliders. Completely overpowering a 650-man garrison. Okay. Well, Hitler's panzers, artillery, and troops, quickly crossed the bridges, and you know the rest of that story. They went into occupied France and so on. They end-ran the Maginot Line, and by doing so, they proved the futility of static defenses, in the age of the airplane and the glider. Meanwhile, military types in the U.S. and Great Britain, they were looking agog at what had happened, and they decided rather belatedly, maybe we need some military gliders too. They had none. Okay. Hitler, in fact, was so impressed with what had happened at Eben Emael that he ordered newer and bigger gliders to be used in the planned invasion of England. Okay. And one result was the Messerschmitt 321. By the way, can you back up for just a second? That picture that just preceded this This one. That was, you can find that all kinds of places, and they say, these are the German troops storming Amol. Okay? It's not. Okay? And the reason I'm pretty daggone sure, if you look at them closely, these troops are smiling. And it's also daylight. Okay, so it's not. I think, in fact, that these photos were taken, for propaganda purposes later, but they were taken during some exercises that they held prior to this in Czechoslovakia, where they had built a sort of a scale model or something of Amol. And these troops they're on maneuvers essentially. They're practicing the assault, but they are not in the middle of a battle. Okay, I'm pretty daggone sure. So a month, I wanted to talk to you about the 321, right? The Messerschmitt 321. We were just gotten to that when I said, oh, wait a minute, we need to back up. The 321 was huge, 321 Messerschmitt, okay. It was the largest operational glider ever built. It had a wingspan of 181 feet, that's not it yet, a 93-foot fuselage. It was capable of hauling 200 fully kitted out troops or a Panzer tank, and that's about 20 tons. It was enormous. Okay. Well, just a month after Aben Amol, Prime Minister Churchill ordered the creation of a parachute unit and a glider unit, and almost immediately the first Allied glider was designed and produced. It was the Hotspur. There's the 321. The Hotspur Mark I glider, and it was capable of carrying 7 combat troops. Okay. But fully 9 months went by in the U.S. after Aben Amol, and there still wasn't a single military glider or a single military glider pilot in the U.S. Okay. Military. Despite the fact that obviously we were going to be pulled into that conflict before too long. Okay. Despite the obvious tactical advantages offered by gliders that were demonstrated by the Germans at the Belgian fort. So General of the Army Air Forces Hap Arnold finally issued a directive on the 25th of February 1941 for a feasibility study of gliders that could be towed by an airplane. I'm not sure how else they thought maybe they could launch, but that was part of his directive. But in March of 41, he sent a memorandum to engineers at Wright Field, which is now Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, to begin designing a glider to be towed singly or in pairs and capable of hauling 12 to 15 troops, plus 4 machine guns and 2,000 rounds of ammo. Okay. Obviously, the German DFS-230 was in his mind when he sent that out. He was looking for something that could silently land troops behind enemy lines. That memo was quickly replaced. He said, forget trying to design this yourself. We are, in fact, what I want you to do is to send this out to various companies, U.S. companies, and take bids on what it would take to build a glider that meet these qualifications. Okay. The winning design was submitted by Waco Aircraft Company of Troy, Ohio. Okay, and the result is the CG-4A cargo glider Model 4. Okay, and it was pretty soon in production. In order to turn out as many as possible in the shortest time, it was built under license to Waco by some 16 different companies, including Ford, the Ward Furniture Company, the Gibson Refrigerator Company. Yeah, okay. You probably have heard of all of those as big manufacturers of aircraft, right? Okay, yeah. None, of course, of these had ever built a glider before. Okay. And one of the reasons that you get this sort of odd mixture was because one of the requirements from Hap Arnold was that they couldn't send invitations out to anybody that was currently building production aircraft for the military. It had to be somebody new. Okay, so you had piano companies, you had all kinds of furniture companies. Said, yeah, we've worked with wood, we can do this thing. Okay, none, of course, had ever built a glider before, as I mentioned, but by the war's end, nearly 14,000 of these Wacos had been delivered to the military. The Waco was big. And let's face it, it was really ugly. I mean, really ugly. Okay. It was a really ugly flying machine. It was slab-sided, squat-legged, blunt-nosed, but it had a real beauty in its performance. The entire nose would lift up, and you could drive a Jeep into that bad boy, okay? Or you could take a 75 millimeter howitzer aboard and troops, okay? So the entire cockpit with the pilots and everything aboard now they wouldn't be sitting there when it went up unless something really bad went south on landing, and yeah, that did happen on more than one occasion. But it could carry up to 4,000 pounds of cargo, and some pilots learned later that in an emergency it could carry up to 5,500 pounds of cargo. Okay, they found that out in Burma. Wingspan of the Waco was 83 feet and 8 inches, length 48. I'm going to bore you with a few figures here, and it stood more than 15 feet high at the tail. And by comparison, the C-47, which would ultimately be the biggest number of tow planes, would be C-47s. It had a wingspan of 95 versus 83 for the Waco. It was 63 feet 9 inches long, and the tail was 17 feet high. So it was roughly in the same size configuration as the glider that it was to tow. The fuselage of the Waco sat low to the ground for quick ingress and egress by the troops, and it sat slightly nose down on a front skid that resembled kind of today's skateboard. Okay, yeah, it just did. The cockpit was pretty Spartan. 5 instruments, you can see there. Okay, the yokes, two large yokes for the pilots. Attached to an inverted V mechanism that operated the flight controls in the wings and the tail. Rudder pedals controlled the large rudder. And the one on the left alone had toe brakes, to be able to try to stop those rolling wheels. The frame was welded metal covered with a canvas-like cloth that was doped and painted olive green. And inside, it was absolutely, again, bare bones. All the control wires were exposed the entire length of the cabin. There was absolutely nothing fancy about this flying machine. It had no creature comforts. It was designed for often what would be a single one-way mission. So the U.S. finally had a glider that it could use in a variety of ways as combat situations determined. An assault glider for the first wave of an attack, or an aerial vehicle to bring in needed supplies or reinforcements, and a retrieval system. Somewhere I've got a picture of this, okay? A retrieval mechanism was developed that would allow the glider to be snatched when it was on the ground, either loaded or empty, and a C-47 would fly over with a hook and grab the line and take it off, okay, from a dead stop. Yeah, I talked to some of the glider pilots who had been in that, and they said it was, from what they could determine, it was a little bit like talking to Navy pilots who had just been launched from a carrier. You went from 0 to about 100 in maybe 2 or 3 seconds, and it would really push you back. Okay. Having a glider in production was one thing, but having pilots to fly them was going to be another ball game altogether. And for 10 years prior to this, the U.S. military had absolutely forbade any active duty pilots, any personnel, period, from flying gliders because they had such an abysmal safety record. And they just didn't want them getting hurt. It's a little bit like a professional ball player today. They tell them, you can't do this and you can't do that, because you're under contract to us and we don't want you hurt doing stupid things, okay? They didn't want them doing stupid things like flying gliders, okay? But now suddenly they needed glider pilots, okay? So in a time-honored American tradition, since there were no military flyers, civilian experts were called upon, and they were often placed in uniform, given commissions, and asked to oversee glider pilot training. So in the beginning, actual training would be done at civilian glider schools. On the 7th of July, 1941, we will get to Normandy, I promise you. Arnold sent out the first tentative call for glider pilot training, and it called for 150 active duty officers to attend a 4-week course that would include 25 to 30 hours of actual flying instruction. The curriculum was essentially that of all the existing civilian glider courses. The requirements to be one of these glider pilot guys was about the same, exactly the same as for fighter or bomber pilots. A first-class physical was required with visual acuity of 20/20. Recruitment for the new program was a little slow. After all, these officers knew that for a decade the military had banned all the flying gliders, but now that a war was looming, it was going to be safer. They said, no thanks, we don't want any part of this. Okay. In December, 5 days before Pearl Harbor, a second phase was initiated that called for 1,000 glider pilots. Subsequent plans after the nation was plunged into war increased that number to 4,200, and finally in May of 1942 it went to 6,000. But still, young men weren't exactly breaking down the recruitment center doors to volunteer to be glider pilots. Who could blame them? Qualifying for the program was tough. Why not just go all the way and enlist as an aviation cadet so you could fly fighters or bombers or cargos and be commissioned at the end of that, as an officer? You got really snazzy uniforms comparatively. It didn't help that the promise of promotion after glider training was a little underwhelming. Glider pilots would become staff sergeants. Yeah, okay. Or if you were already that rank or higher, you could retain your rank. But again, that wasn't working very well. To increase the number of glider recruits, the stringent medical requirements were gradually eased, and even the vision part of it was reduced to 2,100, correctable to 20/20. Essentially, if you were warm, you had a pulse, and you could see through your glasses. You too could be a glider pilot. Finally, it was agreed that upon completion of the course and designation as a military glider pilot with an MOS of 1026, that's military occupation specialty, they would be promoted as flight officers. That was a rank that was new to the service. The insignia was an oval blue bar. There it is. Okay. It was rimmed and bisected with gold. And so, of course, immediately became respected and known as the Blue Pickle. It was often referred to as a third lieutenant. Okay. It was analogous to a warrant officer. Pay was the same as for a second lieutenant, but they had no collateral duties. They had only one job: fly the glider. And that rank, incidentally, went out of existence at the end of the war. Well, actually, there was another job. Since they were to fly combat troops into fields behind enemy lines, and they couldn't just take the next bus or the next train back to their station, okay, they were expected to become infantrymen for a while, okay, and fight along the troops that they had just delivered, okay, until somehow they could be ferried back and out of harm's way again. And then they got to do it all over again, okay. Although their training eventually specified infantry training and weapons qualifications, that phase just simply got skipped in most of the early civilian glider run schools. But it still kind of lagged behind. Officials even considered for a while ordering non-volunteers into the pipeline. You can imagine how that might have worked. A few years ago, I interviewed a P-47 fighter pilot who was already in England flying missions. And he said he suddenly got orders to get back to the States for glider pilot training. And so he and several of his squadron mates got sent, I think, to South Plains in Texas. They spent a month or two there, got their glider wings, and then they were sent back to England, and he went back to flying his P-47 fighter. He says, I don't know what that was about, but I've got my glider wings too. Okay. Someone finally said, maybe we're doing this the wrong way. Maybe we need to do something different. I'm thinking this guy was probably a former sales executive who had been drafted and was now in uniform, because he said, what we need is to appeal to something, to young men everywhere. Okay, so they began suggesting that only real men could be glider pilots. They had to have that something extra, right? And all the ads that they showed, and I'm sorry I couldn't find one, for this. All the ads showed this really nice-looking young woman hanging on the arm of a newly warranted glider pilot. So they appeal to the vanity of young men. Okay, you too can be a glider pilot. Okay, if you have what it takes. Yeah. So they were off and running. The program took off in a manner of speaking. Several bases around the country began to turn out this new breed of military aviator, the glider pilot. South Plains Army Airfield near Lubbock, Texas. I think some of you may have been to the Silent Wings Museum there. It's a great place to do research. Yeah. It was one of the larger training facilities. There were 3 in Kansas, one at Pittsburgh, one at Goodland, and one at Hayes. Okay, and the present-day Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri was another glider training base. They're now, that's where all the B-2 stealth bombers are based. The 509th Composite Squadron, and all of that. They're the ones who fly those Batwing contraptions over the Chiefs Stadium during games on Sundays, right? Okay. But for those who successfully completed the course, they were awarded their wings, which differed somewhat from the Army, the conventional Army pilot badge. A G was superimposed upon the shield of the wing insignia. Okay. And earlier I was talking to a former Air Force C-130 driver, and I said, you got that shield there in the middle of your wings, and I said for the glider pilots they put a G on, and regular flying types of powered aircraft said, what's that G stand for? What is that, grounded? Yeah. And the glider pilot said, that G, son, stands for guts. And believe me, it took guts to fly one of those things, and we'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. Well, it didn't take long to get both American gliders and American glider pilots into action, and they soon proved their boast to be, it took guts, to be the absolute truth. It took guts to fly those Wacos into heavily defended landing zones, and if they survived the crash landing, to fight alongside the infantry they had just carried in. In July of '43, CG-4A gliders and 22 American pilots joined a combined American-British operation in an aerial assault on German-held Sicily. It was the first time for the new untried combat glider, and obviously it was the first initiation for those volunteer Americans who participated as co-pilots to their British pilots. It didn't go well. The initial assault was planned for the darkness of night, despite several objections by senior officers to the obvious dangers and the obvious that they hadn't been trained to fly at night. The Skytrain of 144 gliders and their tugs left airfields in Algeria, and to avoid detection by the Germans, flew at only 200 feet above the Mediterranean. A very complicated course was devised, which proved difficult for these young and largely inexperienced aviators. And it nearly doubled the straight line distance. And finally, severe turbulence was encountered. 3 of the gliders broke loose from their tugs and went straight into the sea with the loss of everyone aboard. It was going to get worse. The roar of the engines of such a large Skytrain alerted the German defenders, and soon anti-aircraft fire sent streams of lethal tracer rounds into the air. Searchlights are going everywhere with these large columns of blinding light. They flashed into the cockpits and, momentarily blinded the pilots. Flak was exploding in these brilliant colored flashes all around them. And the island began to resemble the night sky on the 4th of July in Philadelphia. Okay. Many inexperienced and probably frightened tug pilots simply released their tows too soon, some several miles from the shore. And eventually, over several days, the Allies did take their objectives, and they considered this assault a success, but it came at an appalling cost to the glidermen. Each of the tug aircraft on the initial assault made it safely back to North Africa, but of the 144 gliders that initially took off, only 54 actually touched down on Sicilian soil. Most of the others were lost in the sea. 605 officers and men were killed. 326 of them were presumed drowned. 88 British and American glider pilots were killed. And this doesn't include the casualties that were suffered earlier when Allied naval forces shot down 11 C-47s carrying paratroopers. because they flew over at night, and nobody bothered to tell the Allied Navy that they'd be doing that. And so you can imagine when they heard the roar of all these planes coming overhead, those Navy gunners just let loose, shot down 11 of them. If that fiasco were not enough, on the 1st of August, 1943, a Waco glider accident occurred in St. Louis, Missouri, that threatened the entire program of American glider production and glider pilot training. One of the firms that was building gliders under a government contract was the Robertson Aircraft Corporation of St. Louis. It previously was best known as the employer of a young airmail pilot, a guy named, what was his name? Charles Augustus Lindbergh, yeah. And the company, in fact, had even backed the loan to build the special Ryan monoplane that he flew. Robertson assembled gliders in its St. Louis plant, and they used parts subcontracted to a variety of other companies. And on this particular hot summer day, it was a Sunday, company officials were going to show off their work, while also pitching for war bonds. A crowd of several hundred people had turned out to see the assault glider, and there was an atmosphere not unlike that of a county fair. A CG-4A that was built by Robertson was rolled out at Metropolitan Airport, which is now Lambert Field, and 6 souls boarded it for a ride around the pattern. It landed, and more passengers boarded, this time primarily dignitaries and officials of the city of St. Louis. The mayor, the assistant city controller, the director of public welfare, the president of the Chamber of Commerce, a county court judge, as well as the president and vice president of Robertson Aircraft Company, climbed aboard, along with the Army flight crew. They were towed aloft by a C-47. Things had gone well to that point. But immediately after the glider released from the tug, the right wing collapsed and then tore loose from the fuselage, and the glider plummeted straight into the ground from about 1,500 feet. Pieces of the wing floated down like autumn leaves, after it had struck. Do I need to say there were no survivors? Was it a fatal design flaw? Was it a construction error? A lack of proper inspections? Well, all Robertson-built gliders were immediately grounded, and an inspection pinpointed the cause of the crash as a defective wing strut bracket. The wing strut was a metal brace that held underneath the wing and attached the fuselage to give it some stability and sturdiness. Okay. A subcontractor had produced brackets that were machined with walls, into which that went, with walls only 2 30-seconds of an inch thick. Yeah, I know that's a 16th, but we're dealing with 30 seconds, okay? 2 30-seconds of an inch thick. 11 30-seconds was the spec that was required. It turned out that the inspector of the parts had no previous experience, and he had no tools for measuring the required tolerances. So we have 10 dead folk in a CGA glider. The glider program was soon back on track, however, and aviation fatalities, after all, were an accepted fact. Public tolerance for these deaths was really pretty high. Anybody have any clue as to how many young men and even a few young women were killed in aircraft training accidents in World War II? Any clue? 15,000 were killed in aviation training accidents in World War II. There was a war on. It's like, I guess that's just the cost of getting ready to make the world safe. But can you imagine what would happen today if that were to occur? Can you imagine all the congressional hearings and the investigations and the stopping of the program and all of that? Yeah. Well, you remember what Phil Cochran said. Okay. Then there was a top secret mission after this, okay, into Japanese-occupied Burma that proved the viability once and for all of combat gliders to the American war planners. Operation Thursday began on March the 5th of 1944, and it involved U.S. Waco CG-4As that were towed by American C-47s and flown by American pilots, and they carried British special forces some 200 miles behind Japanese lines to land in jungle clearings at night. You remember Phil Cochran said anybody who flies a glider is a damn fool, and I think maybe he really felt that. He did not. I mean, he stayed back in India, okay, to oversee all of this, and he let Johnny Allison fly one of the first gliders in. As it turned out, most of the gliders that went in were destroyed or badly damaged on landing because nobody had detected. They had this tall elephant grass, and nobody saw the logs and the holes and the stumps that were all over this, and the gliders came in and they just ripped themselves apart. Okay, something like 24 troops were killed. Okay, several glider pilots were killed. Nonetheless, the week-long mission was considered highly successful, and today's Air Force Special Ops considers Operation Thursday the birth of today's Air Commandos. I was invited to talk to that group in March of this year for their 75th. And we had 3 of the original Air Commandos there, and the Air Force couldn't do enough for them. It was really, really kind of inspiring. The vice commander of that mission was Colonel Johnny Allison, who had been an ace in the Flying Tigers. He was summoned by General Dwight Eisenhower to his command headquarters in London, in England. Following the mission, Eisenhower wanted a report and recommendations for the use of gliders in the upcoming cross-channel invasion of France. Since several gliders had been lost in the original double-tow configuration at the outset of Operation Thursday, Allison advised against towing more than one glider at a time. And so we are now finally to the use of gliders in Normandy. Okay. In intriguing use of deceptive mission names, we all know, what was the name for the whole operation? Operation Overlord. Anybody know what the aerial assault portion of that plan was? Kind of deceptive. And, you know, if you just had to guess, you might not. Operation Neptune. Yeah, okay. Well, let's regroup. Let's go back and ask this question one more time. Why gliders? Why are they thinking about using something that primitive for something this important? Okay. Well, stealth, of course. We saw what happened at Abe and Emil. But why not just have, say, paratroopers jump? Well, there'd been several combat operations involving paratroops, and they found out that they got scattered all over hell's half acre, okay? And so they ended up fighting in units of 1 and 2 and 3 paratroopers. If you could land and people survived, then you already had the makings of a small unit, okay, if they went in by glider. There was also that thing about heavy equipment, kind of hard to parachute it and have it survive. And then there's that thing about trains. You know, you see trains all the time, and they're pulling, you know, maybe, I don't know, up to 100 cars loaded with stuff, okay, that you couldn't possibly have loaded on that engine by itself. Okay, so there's that. How about, why not just use helicopters? Well, because they had very daggone few helicopters. The first 4 operational helicopters had been used in Operation Thursday in Burma, okay? The YR-4 Sikorsky helicopter. It was a little bit underpowered. It could carry 1 passenger, and only if the pilot weighed less than 140 pounds. That was the requirement, okay. Well, after Abe and Emil, war planners were committed to the use of assault gliders. If Hitler's Atlantic Wall and that whole series of emplacements and pillboxes, mine beaches, underwater hazards, concentrated troops, if that were indeed impregnable, as he boasted, then it made some sense to simply hop over it and come in from behind. So planning for the aerial phase fell to the 9th Army Air Force, which was a tactical branch that had previously been almost an adjunct to the strategic 8th Army Air Force. My dad was in the 8th. He was a proud member of that group in England, and he always referred to it as the mighty 8th. He couldn't just say the 8th Air Force. It was the mighty 8th, son. Okay. On the 15th of December, 1943, cadres of senior officers were assigned to London to plan every phase of this upcoming attack. It was really a massive undertaking. I mean, just to give you some idea, one of the sort of subunits was the signals unit. And they were charged, one of the things they had to come up with was to establish a plan and to coordinate radio links between the U.S. and British ground, air, naval forces, radio and radar sighting, where to put them, radio frequencies to be used, cable circuit allocations, air-to-ground coordination, elimination of interference between radio and radar units, and assignment of discrete frequencies for air-to-air and air-to-ground frequencies. But of course, most of you have heard the thing that, the best plan, the best battle plan, just gets thrown out the window as soon as the shooting starts. Okay. Well, one of the issues that had faced the air commandos in Burma was the loss of their radio when the glider carrying that crashed. Okay, so they spent about 24 hours deep in the jungle with no way to get back to the command headquarters in in India, that, yeah, we made it. And they didn't know for about 24 hours what the heck had happened. Okay, we'll see that happens in Normandy too. Okay, let's look at the plans for the use of gliders, which fell to the 9th Troop Carrier Command, which was one component of the Army, 9th Army Air Force. Gliders had been arriving in England for months prior to the invasion. One issue that was never resolved through the entire war was how to do this, how to send these gliders, which are huge, over. Now, the bombers and the cargos, they just flew over. The fighters were strapped, to the decks of ships and try to keep the salt water out, and they were delivered largely in one piece. But the gliders had to be disassembled. They were way too fragile for that. They had to be totally disassembled and packed into, for each glider, 5 enormous crates. Okay, and then when they got to England and transferred to their reassembly point, which was Greenham Common, sort of southwest of London, then they had to be put back together, and that was a problem. Okay. Initially, untrained British civilians were engaged to put these complicated gliders together under the direction of a single sergeant, using one set of highly detailed written instructions. There's something like 70,000 parts in one of these gliders. Well, that didn't work out so well because an inspection of the very first 62 gliders reassembled showed that 51 of them were not even airworthy. That is, they were either incapable of flight or they were too dangerous to even attempt it. Okay, so in October of '43, a team of 9th Air Force Service Command specialists was sent, and they replaced the inexperienced British civilians, but it turned out they were just as inexperienced. The work went slowly. They'd been given a quota of 600 gliders to finish by the end of the year. By the end of December, they had 200. Okay, but with more experience and more specialists, that finally began to creep up. And then in March of '44, a major windstorm came through and destroyed 100 of them. Yeah, say, darn it. Okay, well, the loss of that shocked the war planners when they realized there may not be enough gliders for this invasion. So newly arrived glider mechanics were rushed to Cookham Common, where they worked 3 shifts around the clock, 7 days a week. By the middle of April, they had 910 gliders reported ready for flight. One quick aside. One glaring frailty of the Waco was revealed in the Burma campaign. Pilots sat in the nose of the glider with almost no protection. I don't know if we've got a slide that shows this or not. One glider pilot told me, a friend, Lieutenant Charles Turner, told me that the glider pilots learned very quickly, in an assault. As soon as you touch down, get your feet up, put them up on the panel, okay? Because when you hit something, if you didn't have your legs out of the way, they were going to get crushed, okay? There was nothing between you and the outside. Kind of like driving a Volkswagen and hitting a truck. Yeah, kind of like that. So they came up with something called the Griswold nose, kind of a roll bar. There it is, right there, okay? That was supposed to absorb a lot of the impact if they hit something untoward. But they began doing that, but by the time of the invasion, only 300 of them had been installed. So most of them did not have the Griswold nose. By June of '44, the 9th Troop Carrying Command had 2,000 Waco gliders in England, along with 1,022 C-47 and C-53 tug aircraft, plus 360 British Horsa gliders, and another 200 horses for a possible mission with the British Airborne Division. To fly the gliders, they now had 1,352 glider pilots and 455 co-pilots. Some of you are good with math and you've already figured out, I'm not sure that's equal. Well, to make up for the shortage of qualified co-pilots, the glider pilots frequently ask one of the glider riders, the glider infantry troops, to sit in the right seat. As they began to be towed aloft, he'd say, now if I get killed, here's how you're going to land this thing. I'm not making this up. Well, that was the extent of the flight training for far too many so-called co-pilots. The initial American glider role in Operation Neptune was planned as 4 missions altogether. Chicago, and they were going to transport soldiers of the 101st Airborne, and Detroit, ferrying the 82nd Airborne Division. And they were going to take off and land in the pre-dawn darkness of the 6th of June. And these were to be followed by missions known as Keokuk and Elmira, with reinforcements for both the 101st and the 82nd, but they would touch down late in the evening of the 6th. Then 2 more glider missions called Hackensack and Galveston were flown on D-Day +1 with more troops and more equipment. But as the time drew near for the anticipated launch of airborne troops and glider infantry set for the 5th of June, as we already said earlier, the weather turned sour. There were low clouds, high winds, turbulence, rough seas. It made postponement. There was no question, they had to postpone. You can just imagine the anxiety and the tension that accompanied that decision. Some might say it was kind of a cruel trick by nature, but you know, really, nature just doesn't care. Okay, it wasn't a trick. Nature just doesn't care what we do. But Ike's chief meteorologist said that there was going to be a break in the weather that would enable the plans to go forward the next day on the 6th, and decided, some said, no, don't do it, it's still too bad, and others said, yeah, we need to, let's do it. So Ike sort of bit the bullet and said, yeah, we're going to do it. Okay, so across Operation Overlord would begin with Operation Neptune in the early morning hours of the 6th of June. Across the entire southeast corner of England, the growl of hundreds of radial engines echoed over the countryside beginning about 10:30 that night of the 5th. The first Pathfinder aircraft took off at 11, and they were to mark the landing zones with beacons, okay? All of the aircraft were painted with the now famous invasion stripes, those broad black and white stripes that circled it. So they were to offer unmistakable identification that these are Allied planes. Try not to shoot them down if you're an ally, okay? The secret order to paint those planes and gliders was just given the day before. It was given the 4th of June, okay? So they had these poor guys out there all night long painting stripes, okay, on all of these aircraft. The idea that was, if not totally eliminated, at least cut down on friendly fire casualties. The first gliders in the Chicago mission began rolling behind their tugs at 1:19 a.m. from Aldermaston Airfield, southwest of London, carrying troops of the 101st. Paratroops had already been flown to the same target area under the command of Major General Maxwell Taylor, who was jumping into the Normandy countryside about the time that the gliders were taking off. They were loaded with troops, small artillery pieces, to support the paratroops, and the objectives were to seize the causeways behind Utah Beach, the bridges over the rivers in the area, and generally secure the river valley. They were going to fly a very complicated route, I think you just saw that, that was calculated to keep them out of the range of German anti-aircraft fire and to avoid the eastern side of the Cotentin Peninsula, which bristled with enemy radar and artillery. So I mentioned the loss of a radio in the Burma campaign. Yeah, well, just minutes after launch, Taylor's radio was aboard a glider that broke loose and went down. Okay, it landed safely, but Taylor would be without communication with commanders in England for the first day of the invasion. Okay, all of that planning by the signals division never included, maybe we need to have more than a single radio. Maybe a backup was a good idea. You know, it's easy for me to say, you know, this is 75 years later. Aircraft and gliders of the Chicago mission were to fly southwest from their many airfields, gradually funnel into a long sky train that passed over the town of Portsmouth and hence over the English Channel, flying at 500 feet. A British submarine was on station, broadcasting a signal, and when they picked that up, they were to turn left and fly a 54-mile leg, pass between the German-occupied islands of Guernsey and Alderney, keeping well out of range of all the anti-aircraft guns. And then they were going to climb to 1,500 feet to cross over the guns and the coast of France. And then as soon as they were out of range of the German artillery, they were going to go back down to 500 feet, enter the approach to the landing zone, which is about 6 miles inland. If it all went as planned, they would arrive at the landing zone at 4 in the morning, 2 hours before sunrise, with a cover of darkness to help them avoid detection. And once on the ground, the troops, including the glider pilots, were to link up with the paratroopers already on the ground. It was a good plan. But it didn't account for several things. One, the Germans knew that an invasion was imminent. They just didn't know exactly where or when. It was impossible to hide the presence of a couple of thousand of gliders being assembled. They knew that was going to happen. And so they knew that at least part of the assault plan involved gliders. And so to thwart the landing of those, a guy named Rommel was in charge of that part of France. They planted what was known as Rommel's asparagus. It was just simply large, 6 to 12 inch in diameter poles, 8 to 12 feet in length. They planted them in fields everywhere they thought a glider might land. Okay. They were actually placed by French civilians who were under the guard of Germans with machine guns. There were other problems. Most of the fields were much smaller than had been reported, and they were lined with hedgerows that had been in place for centuries. Any of you been to France? Have you been through that part, around Normandy and seen those hedgerows? Okay, they're about, 6 to 10 feet high, about that thick, full of roots of long ago trees, and you can't drive through them with a bulldozer. Okay. They often hosted poplar trees to boot that were up to 70 feet high on top of those. In fact, no one bothered to tell the pilots in their briefings. Okay. The paratroops had been dropped all over the Contented Peninsula. They weren't a force. They were simply roving bands of very confused and very disorganized soldiers. So linking up them was also going to be somewhat problematic. But in the very darkness, which had been assumed would be an aid to the glider pilots in avoiding detection, turned out to be a mixed blessing. It disguised their initial approach over the coast, but the dark mixed with some very low-lying clouds caused confusion. It disoriented many of the pilots, and it also hid the fact there was a large flat area that had been flooded. It was known as the prairie. And so many of the gliders landed in deep water instead of solid ground. The same obstacles, darkness and cloud cover, had prevented many of the pathfinders from locating the right places to begin with, okay, and so they were just simply landing blind. Leading the troops in the initial glider to touchdown was Brigadier General Don Pratt, who had originally been assigned to lead the paratroops in the seaborne invasion. A last-minute change, however, placed him in the Fighting Falcon. It was going to be flown by Lieutenant Colonel Mike Murphy. The story of that flight is a microcosm of the glider operations in Normandy. Murphy had been a stunt pilot before the war, and he was an accomplished glider pilot as well. And so he was ultimately placed in charge of all the Army's glider pilot training. He went to England to oversee the last-minute training of these guys who were going to make the assault, and somehow talked his way into flying in the lead glider. Okay. In that first glider with Murphy was his co-pilot, Lieutenant John Butler, and directly behind them sat Brigadier Pratt with his aide, Lieutenant John May. Pratt's command jeep, radio equipment, and cans of gasoline filled the rest of the cabin. The Fighting Falcon and the rest of the Skytrain made it across the channel without incident, but when they arrived at the Contented Peninsula, they began taking fire. The Germans had been alerted by the first contingent of Taylor's paratroops, and they sent up fierce but largely inaccurate fire. Nevertheless, one tug and one glider were hit and went down in flames near Pont-l'Abbé, and several tugs and gliders were damaged. They continued on to the landing zone, and Murphy cut away from his tug at 3:54, 6 minutes ahead of schedule. He was somewhat surprised to make out by the faint light of the moon that there were tall trees surrounding his presumed landing field, but he safely cleared them and managed to touch down with plenty of room to spare, even in a field that was considerably smaller than what he had been briefed. But when he went to apply the toe brakes at the top of the Waco's rudder pedals, he was shocked to discover they were useless. Tall, wet grass had turned that field into a slip and slide. Murphy's glider barreled into an ancient hedgerow, still at touchdown speed. The resulting crash crushed the glider. Murphy suffered 2 broken legs. His co-pilot was killed. And Brigadier General Pratt, sitting in the driver's seat of his Jeep so that he could drive out quickly as soon as they landed, had broken his neck in the crash. He was the highest-ranking Allied officer to die in the initial assault. His aide, Lieutenant May, suffered severe injuries, but he did survive. That's what's left of the Pratt-Murphy glider. Across the Cotentin Peninsula, similar landings were being played out. Some gliders landed without incident, but mostly in the wrong place. Many were smashed when they plowed into the not-as-briefed hedgerows, and occasionally a glider landed in the proper zone without incident, and the troops quickly disembarked. That's very occasionally. Only 6 managed to touch down in the proper landing zone. In the darkness, troops stumbled around in small clusters, sometimes running into squads of Germans who were equally confused, but they were fully alert and out in force. There were firefights with other small units of Germans. American troops could frequently hear the clanking of German tanks passing close by, but unseen behind the hedgerows. Despite all of this confusion, the missed landing zones, and the horrible crashes, there were only 5 troops, including General Pratt, who were killed in the initial glider landings. 17 were injured. The Detroit mission to bring the 82nd Airborne was accomplished with similar results. Wacos behind their C-47 tugs left Ramsbury in the early morning darkness. They followed the same circuitous route over the channel. They arrived over the coast of France with the plan to land just 10 minutes after the Screaming Eagles of the 101st. They, too, met a thick cloud bank over the coast, and 7 gliders were lost when they broke loose from their tugs, the pilots unable to see the tow line or their tug. Any of you ever had your car towed by somebody, to try to get it started or to take it down the street to the garage or whatever? Have you done that? Okay. Imagine then for just a moment, how that goes. You speed up just a little bit. Oh, I'm going to ram them. So then you start standing on your brakes, and then there's a jerk, real hard, and you keep doing that, right? Well, when they couldn't see the tow planes, that's the same thing that was happening, and finally those lines just broke, and 7 gliders went down. They met heavy anti-aircraft fire that shot 1 tug and glider combination down in flames, but they finally got over the landing zone, or what they thought was the proper landing zone, and they just said, we're going down any way we can. Protocol and plans be damned. We're getting this thing on the ground. Most of the gliders were wrecked beyond repair, but miraculously only 3 troops, in Operation Detroit, were killed in the smash-ups, 23 seriously injured. But others had landed in this flat marshy area. They touched down in waist-deep water. And in what was going to become a repeating course, the command radios for General Ridgway had been dropped into the river itself. He had no way of reporting that most of the landing zone for the next mission was still largely in control of German troops. If all of this sounds confusing, it's because it was. The beautifully choreographed battle plans calling for night parachute drops of troops and equipment, followed closely by glider landings with more troops and artillery, they met every bedevilment possible. Poor visibility resulting in scattered and imprecise drops and landings, loss of valuable communication equipment, poor intelligence and recon regarding the fields themselves, too many crashes, too many smash-ups. I'll quickly tell you about the last 2 glider missions on D-Day. Keokuk and Elmira, they were supply and reinforcement missions that were flown in good weather in daylight. Keokuk and Elmira were unusual in that the gliders were British Horsas, that's H-O-R-S-A. They were flown by American pilots. The Horsa was much larger than the Waco. It was capable of carrying about 7,000 pounds. Remember, the Waco carried about 4,000. They were stuffed with jeeps, artillery pieces. It was made entirely of wood versus, remember, the Waco's frame was metal, welded together. American pilots much preferred the Waco for its metal frame, which they believed gave them a better chance of surviving a bad landing. The Keokuk mission was to supply the 101st. 32 of these gliders lifted off. Most of they began firing. The German infantry held the fire. The Utah Beach was now held in American hands. They flew over Utah Beach. Germans held their fire until they were inland, then they fired at them with their rifles. But most of the horses released too soon, and they landed on the near end of a very large landing zone that was still under intense German fire, which combined with the fire and bad landing accidents resulted in 14 deaths, 30 seriously wounded. Elmira, the final mission, was the worst in terms of casualties. They flew 176 gliders. In the event, the whole thing turned out better, I suppose, than we could imagine. The air was filled with C-47s, and soon gliders circling desperately, trying to find a place to put down. Most were able to somehow slam down, and despite crashing into hedgerows and trees, the British Horsa gliders managed to remain intact enough to protect the pilots and the troops inside. The vast majority were broken beyond any future repair, but there were comparatively few deaths. Remember that after a cargo glider is released from its tow, there's only one flight profile: down. There are no go-arounds in a glider. Okay. Today, in the trees lining the fields of French farmers, you can still see the occasional rusting results and the remains of hundreds of Allied gliders that were used in the greatest invasion of human history. They remain as silent reminders of a terrible battle for freedom. They stand as monuments to the courage of those who flew in them or rode in them as passengers. We're running short on time. I'm going to summarize. Gliders were already an anachronism when they were pressed into combat during World War II. They were never used in combat again. They were replaced soon by the helicopter, which didn't need long fields in which to land, and it could be used over and over. Were they successful? Final reports by the Army Air Force Historical Unit record the numbers. During the first day of Operation Neptune, 512 gliders were dispatched. 9 were lost en route. 4,047 troops were landed on or near their objective, along with 110 artillery pieces and 281 jeeps. More than 412,000 pounds of combat equipment and supplies were delivered. The cost? 25 American glider pilots dead, 31 wounded, 91 seriously injured, and 33 prisoners of war. Gliders were used again in the drive into Germany and southern France, Holland, Bastogne, and crossing the Rhine. More pilots and glider riders would be wounded, more would die. The great newsman Walter Cronkite, remember him? Okay. He rode a glider into the glider assault in Holland, and he later wrote this: "I'll tell you straight out, if you've got to go into combat, don't go by glider. Walk, crawl, parachute, swim, float, anything, but don't go by glider." This comes from one who did it once. I came away with unstinting admiration for those airborne troops who did it more than once, and a lot of awe for those glider pilots who did it over and over again. The men who wore the G-wings proved over and over again that their motto was not an idle boast. The G did stand for guts. Okay, thanks. You put up with me. Let's see if you've got any questions, okay? Okay, so we've got a wireless mic over here just standing by to stand by. And if any of you have questions or something to add to this, personal information, or I know that we have at least one person in the audience today. Do we have any glider pilots from World War II with us today? Okay. I meant to do this at the very beginning. How many veterans do we have here today? Veterans of any service at any time? Do we have any World War II veterans? We have one? Okay. Sir, we salute you. Thank you. Well, I know that I talked way too long. We need to get out of here. But if you've got questions, we can answer in about the next 10 minutes. We can do that. Looks like we've got a question.
Did the Germans, was there any information on the Germans? Did they do better? And did they follow up? Was the whole glider thing that you talked about with them just a influx to get them into planes?
Okay. You know, after they had taken over most of Europe, they didn't need to be using gliders as attack vehicles anymore, right? Okay. So they had the initial surprise advantage at Aben Mall and some other places. And they did not, of course, end up using that gigantic Messerschmitt 321 to invade England because of there was a handful of Spitfire pilots, often referred to as the few, who had something to say about that. And they said, no, not on our watch. Okay. Another question. Is there a question here?
Well, I went to the museum in January in Texas.
Oh, the Silent Wings Museum in Lubbock.
Silent Wings Museum, the only one in the world, and it was totally fascinating, interesting, but there's also a book of Walter Cronkite, Hal Boyle, Andy Rooney, and a couple of others, Assignments to Hell, that really tells you about them going in and the gliders. Very interesting if you're a history nut.
Yeah. An interesting thing about the CG-4A restored glider in Lubbock is that you can look at it, you can peek through the door, but unless you were a glider pilot or a glider rider of World War II, they will not let you inside. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Pretty Spartan, pretty bare bones. Okay. Any other questions? There's one back there.
Okay. Did the leadership for the gliders foresee that they might end up dispersed, and did they have a plan to regroup before they went?
I think the disorganization and the chaos caught a lot of people off guard, including the command structure. I think that they thought that they were going to stay fairly close together. And of course, the plan was for those landing zones to be well marked so that by the pathfinders, so that you'd have a number of gliders together with all of their what they thought intact fighting units aboard. So I think they were somewhat surprised at the chaos that ensued. You bet. Okay, thank you very much. I'm sorry I talked so long, but I get carried away on this stuff. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.